Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we're going to begin the funeral services of David N. Appel. Rabbi Rachel Weiss, Cantor Howard Friedland will be officiating. We want to welcome those of you who are watching via live stream. For those of you that are in the synagogue, please take a moment to be sure that your cell phones have been turned off, not to disturb the sacred funeral ceremony. At this time, the rabbi and cantor are going to approach the family to perform the ancient ceremony of Kriya. So if I can kindly ask the entire family in the first row to please rise and gather together as the clergy approach. And once again, just as a last and gentle reminder, please be sure your phones are off.
Well, this morning, this room feels oddly quiet. And it's probably because David is not talking, or laughing, or connecting, or filling up this space. And that is a sweet way that we open and remember and acknowledge the death of David Appel and feel the loss of his presence in his family and community and friends and in the larger world. And so we gather here on this morning in a place where it now turns to us to fill the room with stories and remembrances and acknowledgement of the very real truth that David has died. And we are here. We often say at JRC that one of the most sacred things that we do for one another is this mitzvah, this sacred act of showing up, of being present, of simply being here together to be able to witness and hold each other And a funeral service is just that, to be able to witness and hold the life story of someone who lived it very fully for 90 years and 2 days, who celebrated his birthday with his family, both in person and on Zoom, in wonderful, full ways, and to acknowledge our sadness that his life has ended. This morning, we will begin to start to think about how we talk about him and remember him. But first, we come together in acknowledgement of the fullness of his life. One of the things that we know about David is that he was prolific in all senses. In his talking, in his writing, in his editing, in his ability to keep filling up and telling more and more and more. And we probably didn't imagine that there would be an end date to that. But we also, as human beings, know that everything that is alive, including us, has a beginning and an end. And in the middle is what we call living. And so what we are here to do in this funeral ritual today is to be grateful for all of the life that David lived and to mourn the fact that he is no longer here. We remember David Norman Appel, who lived 90 years, the son of Alexander and Anne, the brother of Sylvia of blessed memory, the husband of 61 years of Rena, father of Elliot and Jeremy, and father-in-law, but really also father for Tamar and Julie, the Zadie of Sam and Abe and Nate, of Zachary and Simon and Iman, and Joseph of blessed memory, cousin to Mel, and favorite Uncle David to so many nieces and nephews. But more than that, friend and community member, both in Hyde Park and South Shore, and Hyde Park and Union Pier and the Mather, in so many communities and conversation circles, ways of being together and experiencing his presence. It would be impossible to tell the entirety of his life story here, and that's not what we're trying to do in this next hour. But as someone who loved grammar and the particularities of language, to actually shift how we think now of talking about David in the past tense. That takes a while. Because with anyone we love, we expect them to come through the door and sit down and be with us and be among us. And so what we do in this sacred ritual this morning is to help to all of us to hold some of the parts of him that we loved best, to hold on to the parts of his life that he struggled with, because all of us are human beings and none of us are perfect, to be able to hold the reality of his life and to appreciate it and to open the door to thinking about how we will remember him. We won't tell all the stories now, but perhaps give us that sacred mission, which is to tell the stories and carry the stories with us as long as we are still alive. And so we do that. But most importantly, we do that from the mouths and the hearts of the people who knew and loved him most deeply and loved him best. For all of the days of their lives up to this moment, Elliot and Jeremy have had your dad here. And while he wrote many, many, many people's beautiful eulogies, he did not write this one. It would not have surprised us to open up a computer file and discover that perhaps he had written this one. Perhaps we were even hoping that we would discover that David had written this one. But that's also the reality, that none of us can do it all. And that we pass on to our generations the things that we loved the best and the things we could do to be able to take care of them so that they, in turn, can do the same sacred task of taking care of us. So we're going to first hear from Elliot, and then we'll hear from Jeremy. as we begin to remember and start to tell some of the pieces we loved best and some of the story of the life of David Appel.
Sometimes I think I'm a wigwam. Sometimes a teepee. Doctor, what could be wrong with me? You're 2 tents. If there was one thing we could all agree on about my father, it's the jokes. Many, many jokes. Not so many that we hadn't all heard many of them. And often, we had heard many of them many, many times. I could say number 31, or a hammer and an Oreo cookie, and many of you will know immediately which David Appel joke that is. He used jokes, good jokes, bad jokes, not quite jokes, along with puns and limericks and shaggy dog stories, not only for entertainment, but to connect to people. He loved people. He loved jokes, and he loved scholarship, history, politics, literature, Judaism, all kinds of scholarship, and he loved debating all of these. But he really loved people. He wanted to learn about them. He wanted to connect with them. He wanted to understand what makes them tick. He brought people into his orbit, and he never let them go. His bunkmate Ronald, from their Army days at Fort Sheridan, a fellow scholar who became a lifelong friend, had my dad serve as best man at all 3 of his weddings. Of course, accompanied by much teasing and joking that was intellectual and less intellectual. His friend Marvin is here from their childhood together in Detroit, with puns and jokes that are hysterical, along with those, Marv, where are you? Along with those that are more questionable. As part of a lifelong exchange, his cousin Mel is here, with stories of their shared family misadventures. His nieces and nephews and cousins, his more recent friends from the Mather, his doctors, the adult and not so adult children of his chosen families from Hyde Park, from Union Pier, from several institutions of higher learning. I can't describe how many people in this room and in our lives have reached out this week to say something along the lines of, "He was my favorite person in the whole world." My dad could get anyone to open up and connect. It might have been through coloring with a young cousin Lorelei, through Passover seders by Socratic method with teenage Frischers and Whiteleys and Zellmans and Matusans and Holtzes, through football debates with grandsons and with taxi drivers, through trying to fix up his bonus grandson Iman with every single young Afghan woman working at the Mather, through discussing Jewish history with his oncologist. He always found a way to connect with people. I remember he invited the esteemed Senator Frank Church to speak at an academic panel when I was a kid. The thought of booking a hotel never crossed my dad's mind. "Elliot, you can stay in Jeremy's room for a few nights, and Senator Church will have your room. And Rena, we'll have a great dinner party." The senator and the other guests in our family all had a fabulous time. I met Barack Obama when he was running for the US Senate, and I said, "You're my parents' state senator and neighbor." Obama asked who my parents were. When I said, "Rena and David Appel," he asked, "Is that the same David Appel who thinks he's the mayor of our block?" We agreed there could be no other David Appel. So when my father would get stopped on the street by a seeming stranger, and they would exclaim, "Professor Appel, you were my favorite professor," I was never surprised. It didn't matter how old they were or if he remembered them at all. They remembered him, his way of connecting, his refusal to start class until somebody shared a joke. Sometimes they remembered his jokes. I don't know if they remembered any of the European history or political science he taught, but they remembered him. He was always connecting with people. My father may have left us after an amazing 90 years, but the connections he forged with people of all kinds, and the love and affection that carried through his bad jokes and questionable comments all survive. The wigwams, the teepees, the tapeworms, the wise men of Helm remain with us as part of my dad's memory. I couldn't be more proud to be part of that legacy, to be here laughing and groaning alongside all of you.
Nice.
Want me to read it?
No way. No. I just need to catch my breath. Okay. You might know that Dad had a thing about. No. No. Come on. All right, here we go. Thank you, though. All right, so here we go. Dad had a thing about eulogies, as you've heard. He wrote many of them, far more than he ever delivered. Writing for Dad was about capturing his deeply considered thoughts, and often it was just for himself that he wrote. He took his writing, eulogies and otherwise, very seriously. That was one thing he did take seriously, perhaps one of the very few. He would grind through endless revisions, giving significant time and deliberation to each piece. As I'm less practiced in writing and delivering eulogies, I searched through his things to see if he had started his own that I might use today. Obviously, I need some help from time to time. Anyway, since he always wants things to be thrown away, and he never learned how to organize files, digital files in folders on a computer, I wasn't able to find any draft of a eulogy. So instead, I started a Google Doc, and I was hoping to pass it around and collect jokes that he told from family and anyone, so send them in. But I realized you've all heard all of his jokes. And so then I thought maybe I should come up with something original, so I'll share this. Many of you knew Dad as a jokester, and yes, humor was extremely important to him. He would always try to crack a joke. Some were rehearsed, others spontaneous. Some had a narrative story, others were just a quick pun. Most were long. A few were actually funny. No audience was out of reach, and no topic too taboo. No timing was too awkward, no context too inappropriate, even a funeral, and no joke was too irreverent. No stone was ever left unturned in his perpetual mission to land that funny joke. In fact, Dad's last words, spoken to the cardiologist,
among his last words, spoken to the cardiologist as he was wheeled into the procedure room, were, "Wait a second, doctor. Can I tell you a quick story about the wise men of Helm?" Dr. Jonathan Rosenberg indulged him. According to the doctor, our dad absolutely crushed the joke in delivery. Finally, mission accomplished.
a funny joke. Finally. Gosh. But he was more than a jokester. At 5'4", towering but shrinking, he was a giant.
He regularly came home and he talked about the big muscles on all the athletic guys half his age who he routinely beat on the tennis courts near Eastview Park. For him, these triumphs were almost as good and satisfying as landing the joke. He was the David against any Goliath. He actually saved me from a variety of challenging monsters. In 1974, I was just 6 years old and got scared during a movie, Young Frankenstein. He brought me out of the movie and he comforted me in the lobby. And it was only as I got older that I realized that movie was a comedy. And as I got older yet, I realized what a sacrifice that missing that particular movie, that masterpiece, was and must have been for him because of his affinity with that Mel Brooks really particular sense of humor. So there were other monsters too. Example, a gang of older kids on Chicago's Lake Shore knocked David Reingold and me off our bikes, stole the bikes, and rode off. I've got David Reingold here. Raise your hand. There he is. Thank you. As a witness to the story, Dad took us out to hunt those kids down and serve justice. This is a big group of kids. They were pretty older teens, so he brought along a baseball bat. Now, knowing that he was in our corner for that fight, it meant everything. And, of course, in hindsight, I'm really thankful, I bet you are too, that that fight never happened. The hunt for those kids was unsuccessful, but Dad was our hero. A year or so later, he did not bring a baseball bat when we searched for a different group of kids that knocked me off my bike. Different bike, again, up in Union Pier. We found one kid in his house, in front of his house, with his father working on the car in the driveway. And given the whooping that kid's father was about to give him, when we told him what happened, Dad showed me in a single stroke not to let justice go on, injustice stand, one way to serve justice, and how lucky I was to have my dad as my father. Again and consistently, he was in my corner, a giant and a hero. And he was not just my hero. He was not just my hero. He was an inspiration to many others as well. On the first day of class, in a history class at University of Wisconsin, my professor started taking attendance. He goes in alphabetical order. And A, first letter of the alphabet, usually brings the name Appel up first. And so Appel is often mispronounced, Appel. And so the professor called the name. He said, is it Appel or Appel? Confirmed the pronunciation. And then he asked, when I confirmed it was Appel, he says, where are you from? Chicago. He says, what's your father's first name? David. Did he teach history? Yes. So he took off his glasses and he stepped from behind the lectern. And he then went on to detail that Dad had been my professor's professor. He taught him to think critically. He taught him to debate. He taught him to argue his point thoughtfully and to the end and to defend it. He inspired his interest in history, and he influenced him and inspired him to pursue a professional academic career. This is tough. Teaching history himself as a professor. And so he, after about, I don't know, might have been several minutes, 10, 15 minutes, something like this, of just focusing on my dad, he asked me to thank him for the influence. He put his glasses back on, he stepped back behind the lectern, he picked up the attendance list, and he went down the kids whose names started B through Z. And he would ask Baker and just get eye contact, and then move on to the next. I was really moved, obviously. So if Dad held court in the classroom, well, then the whole world was his classroom. Whether it was at our family's signature Passover Seders, larger dinner parties, on the beaches of Union Pier, in Eastry Park, or in the hallways of the Mather, he was rarely happier than when he gathered an audience of loved ones or strangers, fostered a rigorous debate, encouraged critical thinking, or shared tradition and history. Okay. And as you all know, when he did these things, it was always done with a sense of humor that knew no bounds. So, as we reflect on the relationships that each of us had with him and how they affected us, here's the irony. As we reflect on the relationships each of us had with him and how he affected us and the discussions and the debates that we had, let's celebrate the joy that he shared with each of us. And let's join him in pursuit of his perpetual mission. And let's choose laughter. He would. So I have to. And so with that, thank you. And if you have jokes to contribute to the Google Doc, send them over.
If there is anything that could be said about the members of the Appel family, is that you all come by this so honestly. What you transmit in generation to generation is so very real from the reality of David's life and presence to his sons. And I invite those of you who know the Appel and Felixtine Appel family well to picture in your mind the scene in the living room last night as all of the grandchildren came home together and gradually amassed, one coming in from the airport and one from the bus station and one from college and two from South Africa, flying and making their way to come and congregate together and the volume in the living room. Which, at a certain point, Rena had to say, okay, shh. Because the stories that came from the generation of grandchildren just couldn't be contained. So we now invite Sam and Nate and Iman and Abe and Simon and Zachary to, as a group, come up together to share a collection of thoughts and remembrances and tributes to your Zadie.
As a senior in high school, recently I had to take on the hefty task of submitting my college applications. Many of you know how this whole process goes. First, I began with the question, what should I even study? I started by going through all the different subjects in my head, and I thought, well, there's math, but math is just too boring. There's English, also way too boring. And then there's science, but I suck at science, so definitely not doing that. And then eventually I got to history, and instantly I thought of Zadie, the proud retired history teacher who would debate anyone at any time over any political topic of their choosing. Wow, I thought, maybe history could be the thing that I am interested in. I began to reflect, and I realized that Zadie somehow made school seem interesting. There's something beyond that. When talking to Zadie, I listened to him, and half the time I thought, this guy is absolutely wrong. And the other half the time, I was amazed by how knowledgeable someone could be about a specific topic. I didn't know it until now, but by talking to Zadie and hearing his ideas about many important political and historical issues, he had a massive influence on helping me develop my own opinions and become a young, educated man. Now, over the last few weeks, I've been able to finally submit my college applications, and I'm proud to say that due to hearing Zadie's controversial opinions and heated debates, he has inspired me to study political science in college next year. I will continue to refer to Zadie's opinions as I dive deeper into politics and history, and he will continue to have a vast impact on the way that I approach important issues in society. Thank you.
One of the things I pride myself on is my ability to ask questions. I've learned this from two people in my life, one of them being my mother and the other one being my Zadie. He had the ability to talk to anyone about anything. Love you. He had the ability to talk to anyone about anything, and the amount he learned about people in such a short amount of time was astounding. He had a way of getting people's stories, frequently someone he never met and would likely never see again, and finding or making up a connection with them. When I witnessed him interact with a stranger so often, all I could do was watch in awe with the occasional interjection of Zadie as he inevitably crossed some line my generation has. This summer, I took him to get his haircut, which did not take very long. He did not have much hair. By the time we had left, he had learned where in Bulgaria the stylist is from, where else she had lived, about her family, past jobs, and why she and her husband divorced. He delighted her with the story of visiting her hometown, which was not the slightest bit true. He even had time to try to set me up with her daughter and hear that she thought he looked like Benjamin Netanyahu. I've also been lucky enough to spend a pretty significant amount of time on the receiving end of these questions, where I've not only told him about my life, but thought about things in a way I hadn't before. Before I went off to work at summer camp, I got a new perspective on cabin power dynamics. After spending a year working on a farm, he gave me more ways to think about food ethics, and with much help from Bubby, I've always had a deep love of every moment spent with my grandparents. Thank you.
One trait Zadie clearly had was his humor. Whether this was making a joke we all laughed with him, or his ability to put such a bad joke together that we couldn't help ourselves but laugh at him. A lot of my relationship with Zadie was us shooting jokes back and forth with each other. Regardless of the quality of the joke, me and all my cousins always found ourselves laughing around Zadie. Once Zadie passed away, I began to think about how I wanted to remember him. As I began to reflect, I found myself stuck on his humor and how he was able to bring a room together, but how did he really do it? I landed on the conclusion that it was his confidence. For those of you who spent a lot of time with Zadie, you couldn't help but notice his confidence, but not necessarily his ego, which he did have, but through his confidence with words, you could clearly see his intelligent knowledge, his ability to challenge you, and simply make you feel comfortable. Zadie's way of making people feel comfortable around him was something to cherish and admire. He was a joy to have around, and his presence will be missed. I will forever remember Zadie for his brilliance, his caring love as a husband and father, and all the joyful memories I've made with him. Thank you.
Zadie took pride, as you all know, in being a conversationalist. He loved waiting rooms and checkout lines, mundane places where he might encounter a person who he'd never met and have some semblance of an excuse to strike up a conversation. And really, he only ever needed some semblance of an excuse to strike up a conversation. I'm extremely grateful to have learned the art of conversation from and with him, noticing which parts of his approach I love and try hard to emulate, and which ones are not as valuable to me. One of Zadie's signature moves, which I seem to have inherited both by nature and nurture, is stirring the pot. Poking the proverbial bear, dueling even. Zadie, as a lot of you know, delighted in a little bit of conflict. His opinionated worldview and his love of thinking and debating equipped him with the will to begin arguments and the means to sustain them indefinitely. If he thought someone was wrong, he would tell them. And if they were right, he would wryly ask them to suppose or consider or just say for a second that things were different. And that argumentative impulse wasn't antisocial or antagonistic. It was an expression of curiosity and playfulness. To engage him was never just to talk. It was to spar in friendly competition, or to dance in a careful rhythm, or to share in an impromptu show and tell of knowledge and belief. We never had the same discussion twice, touching on topics from Plato to pedagogy, from fascism to fashion, from Judaism to gender to Jay Cutler. But there were definitely some patterns that repeated. He'd always feint. He'd pose some question to which he obviously already had an answer, and I'd take the bait. I'd jab and I'd shuffle in and I'd say a lot of words in a row to him. He would parry, he'd reference a philosopher or historian who maybe I'd heard of or read a little bit, but never in the sort of detail that he had. We'd go back and forth until an external factor made us stop. Because, as I'm sure you all can tell, neither of us ever won. But winning has never been the goal of a conversation. The goal is always to learn and share your own perspectives and gain the perspectives of someone else, and to show them that you love them by listening to them closely and addressing them with honesty and respect. By this measure, Zadie and I loved one another quite a bit, and I'll always cherish that love whenever I find myself enjoying an argument just a little bit too much.
I first met Zaidi at a family dinner after I became a part of the FA family in 2018. Our initial exchange was brief, yet warm and welcoming, as he went out of his way to make me feel right at home. Zaidi and I quickly bonded over our shared love of history and culture. I would tell him stories about Afghanistan, while he would share insights into Jewish history and tradition. He was always genuinely curious and about my experiences and background, and his warmth made me feel accepted and understood. And in turn, I gained so much from his wisdom and knowledge, which he shared freely yet thoughtfully. His wisdom, combined with his playful banter, encouraged and challenged me to strive to be a better version of myself each time we met and in life. Among all his displays and love, Zaidi couldn't hide his concern about me being single. He would often try to set me up with young Afghan women whom he knew from working in the matter. He even invited me to meet me to their apartment under pretense of needing help, hoping I might meet someone special among his introduction. Now I wish Zaidi had met my mother, because they would have been successful too. They would have succeeded. Zaidi was truly a unique presence in my life and in the lives of everyone who knew him. He became my American grandfather, a role he filled with warmth, humor, and love, and I will miss him dearly. His love and unwavering support are things I carry with me always, remembering him with deep gratitude and affection. Thank you.
In addition to his brains, his mouth, his jokes, his way with words, Zaidi also had a flair for the dramatic. Whether it was rounding up family members to script and perform musical numbers for Bubby's birthdays, hosting elaborate and hysterical costume parties, somebody later asked his sons how they dressed up for Zaidi's 60s party, or plastering his progeny's likenesses on whimsical art pieces, he certainly loved to show off his creative side. While he may not have garnered any critical acclaim, his last, to my knowledge, piece of art, Halftime at the Super Bowl, caused some drama between my brothers and I as to who would get to proudly display it in our home. The stories he loved to tell also frequently had an element of drama and creativity. Put differently, the man loved to stretch the truth. He'd frequently ask a server where they were from, and then have a story ready to go about the time he'd visited their home country. Family connections did not save us from this embellishment either. During college, I shared with him a piece I'd written after visiting a Palestinian village and having a strong emotional reaction to seeing a young child tossing a stone. Thereafter, he frequently referenced his Arab grandson throwing rocks at Israelis, both in conversation and in his writing. His execution may have been crude and insensitive at times, certainly to our generation's hypersensitive eyes and ears, but his sharp wit, inventive spirit, and prolific body of work are undeniably impressive. I hope that everybody here today has an opportunity to experience Zaidi's wacky yet profound art. We have many examples of it. Come talk to grandsons, sons, we can show you pictures, and that it adds to everybody's plentiful memories of him. Thank you.
The 23rd Psalm. Mizmor leDavid, Adonai ro'i lo echsar, Yinot deshe yarbitzeni, Armei menuchot, Armei menuchot, Yenachaleni. Nafshi yishovet, yishovet orev, Yahancheni v'magle tzedek, Yahancheni v'magle tzedek, למען שמו. גם כי הלך בגט צל מוות, לא ירא כי אתה עמדי, שבטך ומשענתך המה ינחמוני. ארוך לפני, שולחן נגד צורריי, נשמת לשמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה. אך טוב וחסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים. אדוני רואי לא אחסר, אדוני רואי לא אחסר.
Perhaps the fullest, most apt line from that psalm says, Kosi rivaya, my cup overflows. That when we talk about David Appel's life, it is overflowing with fullness in all sorts of ways. As we have heard some of his story today, David was born in Detroit, the son of an electrician who worked on a factory line and the son of a grandson of a rabbi and cantor, and carrying that through his life, and lived in Michigan and Detroit through high school and a few years at Wayne University till the whole family moved to California and he would finish college at UCLA. He was on the third ever year course in Israel with Habonim, living on Kibbutz Geva, which would later be the spark that 30 years later, Elliot would then go on that course and would spark many generations at Camp Tavor and love and engagement with Israel and thinking and wrestling and exploring with grandsons and grandchildren and everyone about all different ideas that were planted there, but then continued into many, many, many conversations. What brought him to Chicago was 1957, serving in the Army at Fort Sheridan, where he would become the chaplain's assistant, calling out to the person he saw who was walking around, who looked to be wearing, outwardly displaying Jewish, whether it was tzitzit or other paraphernalia, and say, Shalom Aleichem, to see what the response would be, and then keep talking. He and his friends were the ones who were able to figure out a way to get their own secret private key to the library, which not many, I would imagine, young Army folks were eager to get into, but that became a place where they, in their secret club, would say, first Chicago, then the world, as that became a sanctuary for them. And he would then go on to get to graduate school at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park, where while he studied history and would get his master's degree and do a lot of writing toward a dissertation, more importantly, he met Rena. Standing in line at a coffee shop 63 years ago, and then took her to a conference on what is a Jew, which we can only imagine David had a few things to say about that, such that when he had the opportunity to ask a question, he stood up and delivered perhaps his own version of the panel presentation, not just a question for those who were presenting. But that was his style, to be a prolific professor of history, of European culture, always raising his hand, always sharing a point of view, a teacher and connector, a tendency to go a little too deep and a little too long and perhaps a little too harsh, which is why, as Elliot and Jeremy were sharing yesterday, he'd always grade papers with the ball game on, so he wouldn't get stuck going just a little bit too much with any of his students. He was a wordsmith, and he loved being around arguments, the Socratic method, or thinking about how to share, how to write, how to communicate deeply knowledgeable information that was also at the same time profoundly irreverent in the situation at hand. His charm, his Helm stories, the jokes, sometimes inappropriate, always full of character, could fill the room with laughter. And as you shared last night, he was a lot, a loving lot, but still a lot. And as we can feel in this room, David was an intense connector with his students, his friends, with rabbis, with the random chassid at the Jewish Jewel who he would start a conversation with while Rena would go and do the actual shopping, with the doorman at the Mather. He sought interesting people for a real connection, regardless of the pedigree they came with, something that wasn't always necessarily returned to him and a stress that he carried. He saw people a little bit on the outside and didn't shy away from someone who needed a little extra attention coming into his home and trying to say, what can I give you? How can I talk to you about this? He made the choice to move with Rena as a working class white family to a more middle class black block, being the only white family on the block for a while, with kids also at Jewish day school, making sure that you could talk and connect and be comfortable among the people you were with and be neighbors, which is something that is so desperately needed in this time in our lives and in this very broken world. He was a very, very dear friend, whether from childhood or the army or family, union peer, especially with the Frischers and the Whiteleys, but just so many of you. There has been so much loss in your circle this year as we think about this generation of all of you who have seen so many people in your wonderful good company and circle who have died this year. David was a remarkable Zadie, as we heard, who also shared passions not just for conversation and connection, but for chess and tennis, for making art, and with his attention and presence. And as a dad who modeled what it was like to be a dad, standing up for, nudging and pushing, but loving and caring and modeling. He was also a remarkable son-in-law and made sure to take care of Rena's parents as well, and made sure that there were always people in the family that would come so that their family was the hub, something that we see passed down, Elliot and Tamar, in your household on Dobson Street, which feels like has become this next generation's hub right here in Evanston. He created with you, Rena, this anchor family with dinner parties and deep friendships and good company. Always a little bit of an argument or a little bit of socializing. He was your give and take partner, and the two of you walked through these last 63 years together. And this room is full of all of the people who carry his stories that he taught with them, that help to hold and surround you, Rena, right now, as you move through these next steps that are to come. When we think about at a funeral, we think about the things that we inherit. Some of the things are the things that we want to hold on to deeply, and some of the things that we're ready to let go of. Sometimes we carry with us and we leave these rituals and we think about, that's what I want. And sometimes we think and we look at the patterns in our lives and we say, where will I do something different? Because these are these opportunities in our generations to say, look where we have come and look who's around us. And how do we build the lives that we want to live with what we have inherited from our most beloved people? David carried with him the gift of writing and learning and teaching and accomplishing so much, what might be considered a sort of American dream as we think about generationally moving up from as the child of working class factory workers and moving his way through to become a professor, knowing that all that he created sometimes felt like it also still wasn't good enough. And what would it take for all of us to say what we do is enough and what we do is wonderful, however fully and with pride we can live it? To know that the connections with everyone, regardless of their accomplishments or their pedigree, was important to him. And to inherit from him how to be an anchoring, loving presence, to take the risk to talk to everyone, to fill up a room, and to pass on to generations the joy in life, even also holding on to its struggles, and to be true and keep loving. As we age sometimes, and as was the case with David, we only become the more essential versions of ourselves, such that he was going in, as we heard, for this procedure, telling jokes, such that, as they didn't say, that when the doctor came out of the procedure and shared that he started with a Helm story, the three of you could say, oh, we know which one, and you were right. To know each other so well, and to be able to celebrate a 90th birthday 2 days before an unexpected end of life, with really good Greek food, a delicious overindulgence, a beautiful, wonderful, smiling picture that is authentic of everyone who wanted to be there in spirit being there, and some of you who could actually physically be there in presence. A family Zoom where you could see and share together. And to know that even at this ritual, where he can't be the one telling the stories, we can still be here to carry them on. So we recognize in our Jewish traditions that our bodies and our souls, two very distinct parts that live commingled in the time that we are alive, are two very distinct parts. And when it comes to the end of our life, that our body cannot support the physicality of being alive, and our body dies, we exhale for the last time. And in Jewish tradition, the word for breath and the word for soul, for neshama or nefesh, is the same word. And so we pray that as we are about to lovingly take care of and bury David's body, that his soul is released and comes to live back where it comes from. We don't know exactly where that is, whether it is coming from its original source or comes to rest in our hearts that are torn as wide open as the Kriya ribbons that you're wearing on your chests, to hold his story and carry his memory forward, that it may be a blessing. So I invite you to rise, either physically or in spirit, for the chanting of El Malei Rachamim, as we pray that David's soul may rise, and may we become the keepers of it.
El Malachami Shochen Bamrami Hametze Minochanechon Natachat Kanfe Hashchina V'ma'alot Kedoshim Utehorim Kizohar Ki Amazirim Et Nishmat דוד בן אליהו ואן שהלך לעולמו. אמה בר הרחמים הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור יצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר
Amen. God filled with compassion, dwelling in the heaven's heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your presence, amid the ranks of the holy and the pure, illuminating like the brilliance of the skies, the soul of David Norman Appel, who has gone to his eternal place of rest. May you, who are the source of mercy, shelter him beneath your wings eternally and bind his soul among the living, that he may rest in peace. And we say, Amen. Please be seated.
Mrs. Appel, on behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation for your husband's service to this country, I'm going to present to you this flag. Ladies and gentlemen, the interment service will continue at Waldheim Cemetery in Forest Park. Then the family will be returning to the Mather on Saturday. Please note the information. Today is just a private family Shiva. Saturday is at the Mather at the Fairfield Room. And then Sunday is at the Frolickstein Appel residence. That information is on the service folder, as well as the 3 charitable contributions. 1, the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation. 2 is Akiba Schechter Jewish Day School. And 3 is the Ark of Chicago. For those of you who are joining us via live stream, that information is also on the website. For those of you who will be driving in the funeral procession to the cemetery, the procession will be forming just in front of the synagogue, and we're going to try to use the parking lot. So if you're not going to the cemetery and you're in the parking lot, please remove your car as soon as possible. Please obtain an orange safety funeral sticker to place on the right-hand side of your windshield. Have your bright lights and hazard lights on at all times. For additional measures of safety, we will be providing a car in the back of the procession to hopefully keep other cars from entering the procession. Use your horn liberally as you're going through the intersections, and please do not speak or text on your cellular phone while driving to a cemetery. At this time, I invite the pallbearers that have been asked to serve. Please come forward, which are the grandchildren and the 2 cousins. I ask everyone to please rise as we escort the casket of David N. Appel from the chapel along with his family.